Hello, everyone. Welcome back for your break for the final keynote of the conference. I'm really excited about this final talk. We'll be joined by George A. And George A. is the co-founder of Greater Good Studios in Chicago, which has a focus of guiding clients through complex projects that honor reality, create ownership, and build power. George has been one of the leading voices in design justice, and he frequently engages our community to consider in our work power asymmetries, lived experiences, and the idea that design should be restorative and healing. As usual with the keynote talks, we will have some time for questions at the end, so you can add your questions to the Q&A tab. And this is the perfect way to end the conference. So please help me welcome George A.
Thank you so much, Marina. Can I just check you can hear me and see me okay? It's an absolute pleasure to be here. It's such an honor. Thank you so much for having me be a part of this conference. I know that I was very fortunate enough to be able to speak at a similar conference several years ago, but to be the closing keynote is a real honor. I'll be speaking about design ethics, as it says here at the talk, what happens when we reach peak craft. And my goal is for the talk to be a bit of a sobering moment for us to reflect across many of the themes that came up in this conference already. I'll be picking up from threads that were, I'm sure, were discussed by several speakers already. I just want to be able to make sure that if feedback is going to be able to come, I get a chance to be able to see some of it. So if you can send me feedback to this talk, we very much appreciate it using a couple of these different handles. So Greater Good. So my name is George A. I'm the co-founder and director of innovation at Greater Good. We are based in Chicago. Chicago is located on the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. And I wanted to do that land acknowledgement because it's important to us here in the United States that we do so. Our work has been so important to focus on so many different social issues that our position in the industry, I think, has risen to an interesting place where we started to get calls for projects that are deeply rooted in understanding complex needs and how it intersects with the social sector. That being said, sometimes the role that I feel like I've started to play is a little bit annoying, I guess. I feel sometimes I'm like the designated driver or this annoying teacher's pet, sometimes kind of nagging at the industry, while I sometimes feel like the rest of design is out at spring break doing shots. But the reason why I have this position is because I think that there actually is some risk for harm that can occur in doing design work. And I think the idea that someone is being there as a critical voice, certainly not just me, but by others as well, and many of whom I've seen and have been in community with, who are also fellow speakers at this conference, are doing so because I think we recognize that the chance for harm is present, and that the way in which design work can be conducted has great potential for great benefit, but it does come with sometimes this bit of a shadow. The work that we've been able to do across so many different social sector issues span quite a range. And we do so because I think we have a very basic belief. We still believe as a studio that design can be restorative. And we say restorative because we think that there's been a real shift in how power has been distributed across the globe, usually along a fictional hierarchy of human value. And in the design work that we do, we think that there could be a chance in which we could restore some of that honor and dignity back to individuals who have been put on different places on that hierarchy without their choice. So in order for us to maybe get to that point of restoration, I think it's important that we acknowledge the harm that design can do. Now, Greater Good Studio likes to practice something called human-centered design. I'm sure many on this conference are familiar with this term. And if you're not seeing these particular cute color graphics, there are many other examples of processes like these with other similarly cute color graphics. And I think it's worth noting, though, that human-centered design as a whole almost has like a hidden conceit within the term, because to say human-centered design might help you think that being centered on humans must make it inherently good for them. And I wish that were always true. An example that I think really came to a surprise for me, because it really shook me to my core, that I only learned a few years ago, is the example of the Juul e-cigarette. It's a small product, about, let's say, a few inches long, about the sort of size and dimensions of a USB thumb drive. It's a product that became incredibly popular amongst young teens here in the US and across the globe. And actually, the story about its original origin is fascinating because it was born from the very epicenter of design thinking and human-centered design out of the D School at Stanford. So this quote here from Bloomberg, it says, Adam Bowens and James Monsees were pursuing master's degrees in product design at Stanford when they decided to do something about their smoking addictions. And the reason why I pulled this quote from Bloomberg is because Bloomberg noted that there was an enormous value to Altria, the parent company of Philip Morris, when they discovered that this product, even though it had originally been designed and conceived of as being a smoking cessation product, it turns out it had created instead something that was equally, if not more addictive than nicotine and tobacco. These quotes now are from Stanford's own alumni magazine because they're very proud of this, in their mind, the success of this rocket ship product and company. Monsees and Bowens approached smokers on campus and asked them what they loved and hated about their habit. The complaints were consistent: fear of being seen with a cigarette and paranoia of smoking, and paranoia about smelling of smoke on a first date. Their first prototypes were ad hoc assemblies of bespoke components and items found on drugstore shelves. I think that these guys really nailed it. They followed everything that was taught to them at Stanford around how to use human-centered design to find its power in its product, in its process, and then create a product that I think perhaps might not have actually been as addictive had it not been taught and studied so carefully by exploitation of humans that were at the very center of that design work. I think this is where I think things get really interesting when you consider that by understanding humans and their behavior, what is the risk of using that information against those very same humans? How do we ensure that the knowledge and research that we gather through the methodologies in human-centered design and in design in general isn't become a weapon, rather, in what I would hope to be true, more of an aid, something that gives power rather than takes it away? What I find mind-boggling is to really ask this question: how did we lose our way, though? How is it possible that two young Stanford grads, guided by some of the best in the world, not end up realizing that they were making things actually worse? Because I'm pretty sure that they felt they were very much on track because everyone around them was telling them so. I mean, is it perhaps that design continues to have like this gilded journey where there's a lot of cheerleaders all around it? Now, the thing is, design as a whole is not a single monolith. It is a complex, ever-evolving practice, and it has adapted and diverged into many threads for decades now. But where I think I get a little nervous is where design starts to go outside of its lane and starts entering the complexity of the social sector, as our studio has for 10 years, and started to find that perhaps without deliberate intervention, design really serves society. I think what we see again and again is how design exposes its origin story, and that who it traditionally has served, that is the needs of business, make it a poor fit at times when it starts to enter complex scenarios like the ones that we tackle at our studio. One of the things that I think that most gives insight into why those gaps exist is because from our own design education, we often have real gaps in it. One of the biggest gaps I know of is the knowledge gaps around how we teach and understand power as it shows up in design. Now, to share a definition that my co-founder gave me, is that power is the ability to change another person's reality. I want you to think for a second, have there ever been times when your reality has been changed overnight, just simply by an email or by text? And then similarly, have you ever changed someone else's reality through that glance, that look, that message? That might speak to the amount of power you've been subjected to and how much power you might have. Coming alongside this observation around how power is defined is how power often shows up. And again, I think this is helpful for us to realize, because we are impacted by these moments of how power. And I think because of our gaps in our own understanding of power and design education, it makes us a little bit unprepared. because there's a moment that comes up every time I've ever been in a meeting, this moment of power asymmetry. We think of it as moments when power is lopsided. So just to help kind of visualize this a little clearer, I think hopefully folks can see this. It's just a pointed pink white triangle, but just to kind of make this feel kind of at home, the reason I want to talk about power in this way is that there's a scale change when we think about power, rather than thinking about it at the global world leader level between like a President Biden talking to another world leader, which I'm sure is definitely happening, but the interpersonal level between two individuals, perhaps two people on a team, perhaps two people between on either side of a research table, that kind of scale, we tend not to think about as power. We tend to think of it merely as like interactions or a research participant talking to a researcher. Like the ways in which that scale is described doesn't seem to allude to power, but I think it's absolutely true. Now, the reason why this triangle I think is so helpful is because I want to make clear and make it relate to what you've gone through. So if anyone on this webinar has ever heard of moments or experienced it themselves, when they start a project and from the very first time they hear it, they go, oh shit, I'm never getting out of this project alive. Like this project doesn't make sense, really. The budget is off. I don't know who this team is. The timeline is about a third of what it should be. If you've ever had projects like that, and I know I can recall many in my career where that's been the case, I would argue that is you on the sharp, pointy end of that triangle, which means that there is somebody somewhere else, maybe in the shadows, maybe in the next cubicle, who knows, but someone is on the wide end applying that pressure to you. I just want to kind of make that feel related to what we know in our industry. The way in which power asymmetry shows up is so normalized that I think just to highlight these many, many different examples that we see here, just highlights just how almost comes with the territory, but almost baked into many of the roles that these titles come with. So between law enforcement, they have great asymmetry over their detainees, doctors and patients, employers and employees, funders and grantees, teachers with students, landlords and renters, local government with community, leadership with frontline staff is riddled. All these relationships are riddled with asymmetry. And what I think is interesting is that design, and certainly as of our studio, while we were called Greater Good Studio, we were supposed to be all aligned with the pointy side, right? Or the folks on the right side of this triangle. I think we were a little embarrassed to admit how far over we actually showed up. We're awfully chummy with those on the left-hand side of power. Can you see what an awkward combination of factors that might mean? Can you see how compromising design work in the social sector might show up to be when we have to become pals with sometimes the very same people who are making the scenario that we're working in worse? How often do design and designers work with the most powerful, even in the times when we're supposed to be helping those without much power? Unfortunately, this happens more often than not. And as a studio, we've had to try to develop tools to recognize when that's the case. Sometimes I gut, sometimes I like, through methods, sometimes through just interview and email and phone calls, to turn down projects where we just don't think asymmetry can be disrupted. And that in some cases, our projects actually might make things worse. So let's think about this a little further, because when we think about asymmetry, it's very difficult to think about design work without recognizing some of probably the most pressing relationship that we all have, which is the one that happens between ourselves, which is us on the right-hand side, and our clients on the other side of this bar. Now, whether you identify as a client or designer or neither, I think you could probably tell what those terms almost like come along with as baggage, those expectations that come along. It often comes to me, at least, that clients are the ones that have the question or the project in many cases. And it is us or designers who are somewhat known for having answers. Even if you don't identify as a designer, I think you might agree that that is some of the baggage that come up with both of those names: client with questions, designer with answer. Now, if that's the case, and that is often the case for design work that I've seen, and certainly most of the design work I've ever done in my commercial career, this relationship, I would argue, is that on one that is based on execution. It is simply a factor of trying to work out as a client with the question in hand, which designer or designers or design team or design firm has the right answer for me. And they are executing on the question and the frame as it's been set. Unfortunately, in the commercial sector, but maybe surprisingly even more so in the social sector, the work that we do as a studio, I found that not every question warrants an answer. Has anyone ever here been on a project that just never really made sense to you? As in kind of felt like, why are we doing this? And that ability to maybe question the question seems rather taboo. Unfortunately, because of the way in which the social sector is already very strife with limited resources, can you see why my hesitancy to work on projects that don't really make a lot of sense might be true? You know, I've done quite a number of projects in the commercial sector prior to founding Greater Good with my co-founder. That projects did make a lot of sense, and it kind of didn't matter. You know, who cared if it was just like another vanity project or another brand that kind of doesn't really impact the world, but just is a thing you make? Yeah, I think a lot of design work happens that way. But in the social sector, I think we have to question and critique every project opportunity because the amount of wasted time and resources is of pretty high stakes. Design, as it were, or designers, I think we have often been trained very keenly to say yes, but we don't get a lot of times or practice or training to say no. I think it's something to do with the culture and the discipline that we're in. I think it's the fetishization that we have over award ceremonies and the products that we make and the way in which we sort of celebrate new things all the time. None of those things that we celebrate tend to happen from the no's we give. They're directly related to how many yeses that we've said yes to. So I kind of get now why our culture is so geared and sort of so keenly hews itself to a yes type environment. But I think that that's why when we do design work in the social sector, we actually need other sort of interventions to help interrupt that Pavlovian need to say yes, so we can maybe have pauses and say, should we? Maybe? In fact, yes. In fact, we should say no. Like that type of dialogue can be very difficult to have. And I'd say that as a studio, I hadn't heard of many prior to founding one, co-founding this one, where no was a regular practice. So I'm rather proud of this. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but I think the reason why we're still in business after 10 years is from the practice and the sheer number of breakups that we've had to do. Breakups where we say, it's not you, it's me, I'm really sorry. I know at least I've been counting for about 50 times since we started, with the single largest turn down where we were greenlit for a contract, the prime contract by USAID for $2 million. That being the single largest decline we've ever done, to me is sort of, I'm not bragging, I'm just highlighting that we've been tested up to that much. Who knows what I'll do if I get given more than $2 million, maybe I'll do whatever it takes. But I know at least I've had some practice up to a certain level. In fact, the very notion of trying to say no to projects or clients, I think is worth highlighting a little bit. And this is actually the very first email I ever wrote where the breakup had to happen. It was with our client, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I think it's America's #1 health-focused foundation, and we love these folks to bits. After this breakup, I'm happy to report that we have actually done projects since then. But this first one, being the first one of its kind that I'd ever written, I spent 8 hours writing this stupid thing because I was so scared of what would happen. And I kept thinking to myself, who am I to turn this down? Like, who the hell do I think I am? And what I'm saying is, I think that's what they're going to say when they receive this email. It just seems so obnoxiously rude. So I worked for hours on trying to write this again and again and again. What I realized is that after writing this first one, it wasn't quite as scary as I thought it would be, but there's an underlying structure here. And there's an underlying structure I've relied on for every email that I've had to send of this kind. And I want to share that with everyone here. I want to make sure that you say thank you, because it's really nice to be asked. Please make sure you put the no right up front. Don't bury the lead. Explain it's not you, it's me. And then try your best, if you can, to explain with justification why am I doing this questioning? Is it because this is the first and only time? Is this actually the last straw, as it were? Is this a recognition of, like, we have tried multiple ways to get answers to these big pertinent questions, and at this point we have to now say no? So that justification requires doing an inward look, either personally if you're like an individual, or gathering for your whole team what the justification is. But I think without bullet points with discrete individual reasons, I think we might rely on comfort-seeking language of, we're not a good fit, or we don't have capacity, which could very well be true. But I think this is a great opportunity to clarify, what about this project is bothering me? What about it is not sitting right? And if I can't write it down, how can I at least acknowledge it's there? It is such a learning opportunity for you, for your team, and potentially for your clients. So let's go back to this diagram again, right? Between the relationship between client and designer. If we strike through, as I've done in this diagram, clients holding questions and designers holding these answers, because we just said, well, I just don't really agree with this project. What the hell do you do then? Do you still have a relationship between a client and the designer? I think you do, because there's still a relationship to be had, but perhaps by disrupting what both parties are meant to is expected of them, I think we have an opportunity to have a relationship based not on execution anymore, but to have a relationship based on judgment. I think designers have great judgment if we get more opportunities to practice it. So many other disciplines, the judgment of those trained and skilled practitioners get given an awful lot of leeway on what they believe to be right or wrong, what they believe to be true and sound, or what they believe to be flawed and perhaps miscalculated. Why are designers not given that opportunity in the same way? You see, as designers, we practice our craft again and again and again. And I talked about this earlier, that this fetishization of a craft has led to a situation where we have an entire culture dedicated around it, but not much else. And I think for a while, maybe going back, 50 years, 100 years certainly, when the sheer number of practitioners was so few, practicing our craft guaranteed income. But what happens when we have thousands of designers graduating from schools every year, and they end up in places like a Facebook or a Google or a Samsung or an Apple, in these large design teams with thousands of other designers? Do we end up ever reaching peak craft? If that was the main thing that we were obsessing over, what happens then? Well, I can tell you right now that we suddenly have reached something called design at scale. And there are organizations where that was the primary goal for the last 10 years. And congratulations, we've done it. Do you guys remember when there was a time when we used to talk about how, man, when are we ever going to get a seat at the table? Dude, we are there. We are at so many tables. I don't think that's the problem anymore. My concern these days is that when we have peak craft and we have design at scale, is our ability to start causing harm at scale. The number of ways in which design is the willing co-pilot riding shotgun with technology that is harmful is incredibly common. And our ability to use information about humans, as I described with Jewel, can make for a pretty toxic cocktail, where we have technology that is meant to reach the entire globe, with the powerful nature of which we understand humans and the design responses for those humans, can make for some pretty dangerous moments, products and services that are now quite common across the globe. I think that with the number of designers, places of practice, and the continued awards system that is motivating and compensates craft, I think we might start to see diminishing returns on our obsession over craft. But what I'm hoping for from this talk is to let you know that I think there could be still untapped potential for designers to share their judgment, to practice judgment in a way, perhaps conserving some of their energy, not on every single project they do, and conserve it to maybe a select few, I don't believe I'm suggesting that more judgment will equal less craft, but I do hope that it might lead us to less harm. So in order for us to kind of get this practice, I would love to take a little bit of time, with this opportunity and just give us a little bit of a pause and try to see if we can slow down just for a few minutes since I have your attention for this closing keynote. And in this pause, I want us to try and see if we can use that time to look inward and reflect. One of the mechanisms I'm going to try to employ now is to present 10 ethical questions that I think have really stumped me. And I want to present them to you because I think you've probably faced them. And maybe like me, when I faced these 10 ethical questions, I failed. I failed miserably at answering them. But I think the reason I want to bring them up is because my sense is that if you can confront these questions multiple times, you'll have a better chance of being able to overcome them when they get asked of you again. So I'm going to share these in chunks so that there's a chance for folks to be able to keep note of them. Okay, are we ready? What is design's relationship to power and privilege? Which humans do we center when we say human-centered design? How can designers say no to work when we need to pay off our blank, student debt, medical loans, medical debt, mortgage, rent, whatever? Design is often sink or swim, but why is drowning even an option? Man, everywhere I've ever worked, that was just, I don't think I ever paused to think about it, but it's very common, sadly. How do designers decide which people in need to serve? Okay, that's the first 5. Ready for the next one? Okay. How do we wean design's addiction from whiteness? Why do designers prefer to help people in another country before helping people in their own backyard? Why does philanthropy, not community, set the agenda for social change? What's the cost of speaking up, and what's the cost if we don't? I know I've personally gone through that dilemma many times, and I can tell you the cost of not speaking up gets very underreported. It will definitely take a toll. And then the last one, if they weren't already difficult enough, this last one is a real doozy. What right do I have to do this work? I share these questions not to embarrass anyone, not to have a moral high horse, but just to let you know how impossible they are and how I struggle with all of them still. I think our entire studio does. I'm not sure if I have any satisfying answers for any of them. But what I have noticed is that my continued willingness to ask these questions of myself and of my team is what will make us resilient enough to face these problems and face these challenges, because they inevitably will again and again and again. Whenever design work shows up in the social sector, these questions will come along for the ride. So let's take one last look back at this relationship. This relationship based on judgment between client and designer, where there's enough respect of our views and our expertise that we actually can both participate in a project, in the framing of a project, based on our respective points of view and our own lived experiences. What happens to projects like that? Well, again, to borrow from my co-founder, what she said one day to me was that what we're looking for are clients, ones that are very special, ones that are willing to share their power. And I found that shocking. Because I don't think I'd ever realized how clear it was to her, and certainly not to me. But where we can find those unicorn-like relationships with clients who can internalize the fact that they have a lot of power and they're hoping to find ways to redistribute it. And they might find ways to do that through design and therefore with us, that's very rare. But I think that is what would describe all the clients we've had so far, and it describes the clients we're looking for in the future. Now, the reason why I have such a strong point of view around this is because I feel like I am trying to make up for lost time. For the last 10 years, certainly, as we've been trying to run the studio, I've looked desperately at many of the established leaders who I had been told to look to. And I frankly been disappointed by the advice they gave and or the counsel they provided, because they were so stuck in their ways and around the older models of how design showed up in any space, let alone the social sector. I started to realize that for them, I think I am ready for those established leaders to take those Lifetime Achievement Awards and to get off the stage. In order for this design field to progress and mature and to propel itself into the future, I think what we need now are for the emerging leaders, the ones perhaps on this call with me. And I'm going to ask that all of you start to take up more space. It is time for you to start taking up more airtime, to start hosting your own conferences, to start basically doing a little bit more elbows out and start speaking up for the work you believe in doing, and in the practice that you think are going to lead to new work that is less harmful. And in order to perhaps give us hints at what that might look like, I want to share with you a gift to the conference and share a database that the studio invested time in, as well as help and moderators from the Design Geeks for Good Slack channel. Much love to my moderators over there. Together, we built a database that specifically highlighted the kinds of design organizations that I think will be the future of this field and perhaps the future of design altogether. It's a remarkable list of over 200 organizations around the globe. And I think it's important that you look at not only the kinds of variety of design organization by type, some that are consultancies, but certainly many that are like in-house design labs within government. Fascinating range. And also worth noting is the variety of leadership types. The kinds of people that lead these organizations, to me, look very different than the old established leaders I had been told to look to. So I encourage you to go look there. And if you can, by the way, there's also a place for you to add your submissions for new organizations that we think should be on there too. I'm going to be starting to close and leave up all the big questions that I had, and maybe just leave you with two last rhetorical ones, if they weren't already hard enough. Which of these questions have you dealt with recently? And which of these questions do you expect to deal with soon? And with that, I'm going to wrap, and I'm going to, again, just ask for feedback if you can. I'd appreciate very much to hear from you. Speaking into a black void, which is kind of how it feels. It's a little weird, but I appreciate whoever it is on this call. Maybe there's one, maybe there's two, who knows? Marina, what do I do now? Shall I close off the screen share? Is that how this works?
Yes, please do close off the screen share.
Let me do that. There we go.
While we get situated to be in a shared grid, I can offer to you, I've been monitoring this chat on Brella, and it is absolutely blowing up. I will commit to screenshotting and sending these to you. I was going to do it anyway, but just FYI. A lot of really amazing thoughts here. I will say, George, if I could offer, I know at the beginning of your talk, you kind of mentioned that you were tired of being like the Hermione of this space. But,
Hermione Granger, yeah, that seems unfair. Paul, I love Hermione Granger, by the way, but yes.
That was the image I thought, yeah, that was like kind of the connection I made. But as a shameless fan of your work, I believe we should be able to fan each other and be fans of each other. I think that you give permission for us to talk by talking about these topics that are the invisible pieces of design. I think what that's done is kind of given permission or opened the dialogue in a way, and that goes a long way. I think that when it comes to how we come together as a community, finding the words for it and kind of being able to navigate it together. So for what it's worth, I think that's kind of a very valuable thing that you do for the community, and maybe that's where it comes from, as people looking to you for
that's very kind
for that dialogue.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you.
So what What you talked about kind of makes me think of the evolution of design and kind of where we came from, what we're looking at in terms of what we're pulling from, kind of what the values are. And then there's these beautiful futures that we're imagining, right? We've spent these last couple of days really mapping out, and we all believe in it. But design is in this kind of, we're still in this liminal space where we're trying to do right by each other, by the world, by community, but then the environments around us don't necessarily reward that, or they're kind of really heavily built for the very opposites of that. So the first question is, how do we really navigate being in that liminal space where we're trying to do good, but we're trying to kind of do these things, but it's still in a very rigid space?
Yeah, I think that there is so many different places to look for hope. I know that there are a number of individual speakers actually at this conference that I look to often, Dr. Leslie Ann Noel, Max Major, I know that Hazel White, these individuals who I've known through different circles who provide me with like a peer mentoring. I'm not even sure if they know how much I look to them, but when they've spoken and when they do their work, I go, oh, thank God somebody else gets it. And I think you'd be surprised if you're a single practitioner buried inside of a large consultancy, let's say. I think you may not realize how many other people share your point of view, but they just haven't popped their head up yet. And they may similarly not know that you have those feelings because you haven't popped your head up. And I think while it is scary, it is definitely not without some trepidation to identify yourself as someone who's looking to do something different. But you can do that in I think some smaller ways, and as you get more practice, do it in larger ways and larger ways. I mean, that's kind of, I think, the opportunity that I've been given here is to do that in a very large way. But what I notice is that the kinds of clients that we look to, the ones that help us actually fund the work that we get to do, the biggest barrier, I believe, is that they don't even know we exist. So what I'm realizing is that the louder and the more prominently I can speak about these issues is to help those clients remove all the barriers that they may have to find us. So similarly, if you are looking for community members to be able to speak about this seemingly taboo, but really not taboo topic area, I think it would help if you just let others know that you exist and are out there trying to have these conversations. That community is actually present, but it's just a little bit opaque to you because no one is quite willing to maybe put their hand up yet. I think that some of that action will really help accelerate the liminal space we're in into the future we want.
Yeah, I love that. I call that being the first penguin, the jumping off kind of the cliff to see who else wants to play. How do you say no as an in-house designer?
Oh, you might not be able to. I think that it's fair to recognize that saying no as a consultancy, as a leader, and as a co-owner, there's certain privileges I get that no one else does, other than my other co-founder. But I do think it's worth mentioning that the first time that we did that turn down for 100K, the majority of the time just kept thinking, this is not what you do. This is going to lead to terrible, terrible things. So the fear of it was actually worse than the actual of it. It's just something I would mention. Saying no inside and is going in-house, I don't think one has to be belligerent, and I don't think we have to make a big like self-immolation type of moment. I actually think you can already gauge what the boundary is between yes or no on many things just by being very aware of what's happening inside the culture. So I think you can test that boundary over email, through conversation, through personal chats that you have with your teammates. But I think that what I think is helpful is to work out, where is my line that I won't be willing to cross? And I think that right now the idea of like where you say no to is a little abstract until you're required to look inside and say, well, where's the line that I don't want to compromise? And I think getting the clarity somewhat comes from doing all that like testing, all those little like micro interactions. And I think those micro interactions help you go, oh, right, there is a line there, and I think the line is at this boundary. Sadly, working in corporate America or working really in corporate anything, capitalist as it is, that line will likely get pushed and pushed and pushed. So I think I just want you to be open to not say it's all or nothing, but rather it will be a gradual learning over time.
Yeah. A callback to something that Kim Goodwin said earlier, the always measure two things: the goal you want to achieve and the values you won't sacrifice to get there.
Ooh, that's good. That's good.
Can you share a little bit more about the conditions that were imposed on the projects that you turned down that caused you to turn it down? And was there anything in common across multiple projects that you turned down?
Yeah, I'd say there are. I mean, certainly we work across so many different project types. It's hard to know if there are commonalities, but an interesting clue, which I've started to forefront in my business development calls within the first 60 minutes, is actually how tightly are our potential clients holding onto a thesis? As in, how much are they fixated, not only on the thesis, but the product of that thesis, as in what the solution needs to be. If they are very fixated, almost fetishizing the outcome, then I think the chances of us doing work together becomes slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. If only just because it kind of limits whether or not design does, I think design is kind of fun because we get to iterate and come up with new ideas. If that's limited, that's going to be a little bit of a shame. But the biggest issue is the fact that so much of what we learn from our community members when we do our research often challenges not only the validity of that outcome, but the thesis itself that led to it. So the question I end up asking is, what happens if we come up with something and we discover from research something that says that this project is invalid? How do you think you're going to handle it? In fact, how will your sponsors handle it? Do you think that will be received well? And in those moments, I kind of tend to kind of like answer in one or two ways. One is, that's not what we want. That sounds really painful. And no, we don't have time for that. Or they answer with, that's exactly why we called. And yes, we are ready. So what we're identifying there is I'm more likely to want to work with people who have that readiness for change, particularly readiness for change driven by people who haven't been centered for a long time. And that for us is sort of it's taken me 10 years, but like, that's what I think I'm trying to get to sooner than later, because it comes down to a number of key factors or key conditions, as it were, that will likely let us do our work. And then the whole point of it is we're trying to elevate the voices of people who are never in those conversations, put them in the center and have them drive the outcome. If people aren't ready for that, I don't know why you want Greater Good Studio to help you. I mean, it gets kind of basic like that.
Yeah.
These are great questions, by the way, Brenda. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's wonderful. Let's see. So if you have excused yourself from solving a particular challenge and broken up with a client, how do you deal with the dilemma that probably somebody else who's with less ethical standards might take on the project and make the outcomes even worse? Like, what's the aftermath of that for you?
That's such a difficult question. And I think it has all sorts of ethical compromises in it of itself. Could you argue it is reckless of us to walk away when you think it will end up being worse? Possibly. Where I'm trying to draw the line or draw a boundary is, at what cost will it have on the people I'm most responsible for, which is our team, to be used and spent down on a poorly framed project? Even if it means, unfortunately, that the project might go even worse without us. The reason why I worry about that isn't because our team is, well, I mean, I love my team to bits. It's not even to say that our team wouldn't do a good job. It's actually that narrative, and I think that almost like rhetorical gymnastics that I've seen so often in consulting, that says, if we don't do it, someone else will. They're going to spend the money anyway. If we do it, at least we'll do a good job. That has covered so many sins that I'm incredibly nervous of using that type of language on myself and on my team, even to the point where we say, look, I just don't think we can do it at all. Because that is not only a slippery road, but I think that language can lead to so much self-deception that can be even of greater harm than just walking away from a project altogether. I appreciate the question. I don't think I have a great answer for it, but I do worry about the self-deception that can come from that type of rationale. I've just worked in many places where we did that all the time. And unfortunately, by doing a project, it ends up setting precedent for the next encroachment on that boundary, the next encroachment on that value dissolution. It just gets easier to wear down. It's really tough because it sets a precedent in your studio's history.
Yeah. You have this framing that I really like for your studio about these pissed off optimists. And to kind of bring in, I'm just a forever diehard optimist, to bring in that side of it, I will say part of modeling the behavior of saying no, and this is what concerns me, why I cannot be involved. I'd like to think that there's a place where, something like that may cause a little ripple effect that maybe might make someone think twice or might make a company think twice, even if it's not immediate, even if somebody else takes on that project next immediately. Stuff like that does seed a thought that is the little popping your head out. And I'd like to think that can potentially play a role toward neutralizing that a little bit.
I hope so too. Yeah.
We have a couple of more questions, and we have permission to stretch the time just a little bit because this is so wonderful.
Sure.
One is not a question, but they say, thank you for your honesty about some of your prior work experiences and some of the writing that you have done on that.
You're very welcome. I appreciate anyone who's read any of the writing I've done. I don't find writing to be particularly easy at all. It takes an enormous amount of effort for me. So if I can get to writing one piece a year, I feel pretty good. So I appreciate anyone who's read any of the stuff I've ever written.
So another question, I'm curious about how you build your team. Can you talk about how you find people who align with and are excited to explore that path with you? And then how do you decide, I will add to that, how do you decide to, because I imagine you get an influx of people who want to join you in your work, how do you decide who gets to play?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth mentioning just the basic economics of our studio is just, we are not like rolling in cash. I don't think we ever will. Partly because of the sector is not so sort of like flush with investors. Similarly, our own studio's projections for growth are fairly modest. We've had about one new full-timer per year for the last 10 years. So we're at 12 full-time. Nothing huge, nothing too tiny, big enough for us to be able to have, I think, pretty strong ties with all the team members, and also really require that everybody works really hard because everyone's doing a lot. The process of trying to find individuals means that we often have to figure out, well, what do we need? And I think one of the challenges has been to not fixate over individual people, but to first work out what is the role. That is something that's been very difficult for me as a studio lead. My co-founder has often asked me to not get distracted by an individual whose skill sets and particular persona is so compelling that we want to make a position for them. I think that's a different way about designing a studio. I think what we're trying to work out is firstly, can we make the right seat? And then figure out, secondly, who should be in it. So I think that's part of how we've gone about it. Maybe it's worth noting that in the process of trying to identify the 11 remarkable individuals we have found, there was an interesting moment when we started to actually rethink and do like a racial equity lens over many of the aspects of like the HR pipeline, from how do we write the job descriptions all the way through to the final discussion around, not only salary, but just like how we evaluating the candidates. And I found that to be a fascinating process because so much of dominant white supremacist culture and dominant white supremacist language is embedded in so much of how the mechanics or operations of running businesses show up. It's very difficult to kind of go in piece by piece, almost look at like tweezers and pluck out all the white hairs, as it were, across an entire multi-stage, multi-month process. And to do that with some consistency is difficult, already difficult. But then to do it so that what you end up with not only are people who are interesting to start with, but that also leads to a culture where people want to stay. I don't think we are perfect by any stretch, but I think the goal isn't to just simply have an interesting headcount. The whole purpose, I think, is to create a culture where people feel safe. You know, like one of the questions around the single swim, I feel like that's a whole nother thing I want to write about. So maybe I'll rally energy around it next year, is to work out why is drowning so frequent in the design industry? What the hell is that about? It boggles my mind how normalized we've made violent, literally the language of violence, totally normalized. Like drowning, totally cool, no problem. Like people are drowning in design studios all the time. It's nuts. As opposed to the question of like, why are we giving lessons, swimming lessons? Why are we handing out floaties? Why are we dumping tons of salt into the water to prevent anyone from drowning in the first place? So the idea of like the culture that is a product of the people you hire has to be examined, because both of them are feeding into each other. You end up with cultures that really kind of like attract a certain kind of person. And if you're there going during, what am I doing here? Unfortunately, that means that you have an uphill battle of changing the culture because you're surrounded by people who are may not necessarily want it to be different. So it's very challenging. And I think that what this exposes often is, unfortunately, a lot of fragility that I see in leadership. There is, unfortunately, a lot of comfort measure that leaders have that are wanting to be supported by the cultures that they create. A lot of leaders, I think, unfortunately, are looking for mirrors of themselves versus windows, which is, language I've heard from my kids' school. Some individuals are mirrors, and that's comforting. But to find individuals who are windows into whole nother worlds, that I think is a different way of hiring, that it creates cultures that are both safe, diverse, and competent. I think all of those things can be achieved, but you have to do with a lot of attention. That was a very long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
No, it was there was a chat in the thread that says, "Please never end the conference."
That's that's very kind.
But sadly, this is the hardest part. It does have 10, and I feel like that's a good kind of wrapping thought again to kind of look at the optimist piece of the equation, that if the dialogue and the individuals are any indication of the possibility that what you're talking about can happen, if this week, these couple days are any indication of it, then I think we're in good hands over time.
I hope so too.
There's hope. So
yeah.
So we thank you, George. Thank you so very much for the generosity of your time and your thoughts.
Of course. You're so very welcome. Thank you so much for having me, Marina. Thank you to the whole team that did all the hosting. Thanks to Ulla for putting all this together in the first place, because I think the framing of the conference was so well done. Thank you for everyone. I don't know how many people on this thing are still here, but thank you to everyone who is still on the Zoom.
Thank you. They're all incredible.
Okay.
So I will wrap by saying thank you to the SDN team, to the speakers, and to the audience for allowing me to share this space with you over the last couple of days as one of the MCs, and thank the other MCs for the incredible work that they've been doing for all of us and for the community. And I will leave you with my parting thought of my taking a stand kindness value system by posing the challenge. Think about someone who has helped you in your career, and after we're done with this conference and you've wrapped and you've grabbed your drink, shoot them a text and thank them. That's my kind of parting challenge to you as we think about working and living according to our values within design. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to the SDN team.